Mother, man.
This is Mick coming down from down under. You can listen to me on Murder Metal Mayhem.
Spreading faster than a case of the clap in a trailer court. Able to shatter eardrums within a 666-mile radius. A podcast more brutal than all the rest. It's Murder Metal Mayhem! This is Pete Altieri with the Murder Metal Mayhem podcast, and I'm doing an interview with Mick, a former member of the Australian Federal Police. Mick is an alias to protect his real identity. For our non-Australian listeners, that organization is somewhat equivalent to sort of a hybrid between the NSA and the FBI here in the United States. Thanks for taking the time out to talk with me today, Mick. And how is the weather there in lovely Canberra, Australia?
Mate, it's overcast and it's raining. Australia's been copping it. We've been flogged with some serious weather. A little bit north of us is completely flooded.
Oh, wow.
But, it's sitting around 24 degrees Celsius, which I think is around that 75 Fahrenheit.
Right. Well, that's not too bad. All right. Well, we'll get started here. I got quite a few questions for you today. Now, you're a former member of the Australian Federal Police, and when you worked with them, what exactly did you do?
Yeah, I was with the AFP for over a decade, about 11 years or so. So the AFP is a strange sort of an organisation. It's got four sort of distinct arms to it, but what my role was basically as a detective, as an investigator. So like most state police, I started with general duties, so uniform police, beat cops, you would probably call them.
Right.
And then maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, I transitioned into, criminal investigations, so being a detective with them.
Oh, cool. Now, do Australian police use guns or not?
No, we do. We're very much like the US.
Okay.
So we're more similar to the US, where we carry sidearms, we carry tasers, we carry OC or pepper spray.
Right.
Whereas New Zealand, which is obviously just across the ditch from us, they're more like the UK, where they don't carry sidearms. They don't carry firearms.
That seems so strange to me. I guess growing up in the US, and my dad worked for the parole division in New York, but also worked with training state police in their training center, and just blows my mind to think of cops not having guns.
It's strange. It's maybe they need to rely more on negotiation skills than anything else.
Right.
But we're not ourselves in New Zealand, especially. We're not a massive firearm culture. Like, not everyone carries guns. Not everyone has access to guns.
Yeah,
which obviously we'll talk a bit about.
Yeah,
with,
that's an
Brian.
interesting discussion. That's why I really, really want to get your perspective on that. So, what got you interested in law enforcement, Mick?
Oh, look, it's a roundabout story, mate. I initially got accepted in the early 90s, so 91, 92. But at that time, I was doing uni. I went to uni to actually become a psychologist. So I finished that, and then for whatever reason went down that path for 15 years or so. And then just by chance, I was working with some folks from the AFP, and they convinced me that it would be in my best interest to have a very early midlife crisis and leave being a psychologist and become a policeman.
Wow, that is an interesting path, but it is funny how life just throws curves at you like that.
It does,
something you would have never expected you'd be doing. Just like doing Zoom meetings with people from other countries. It's just crazy.
Exactly, mate. It's not something that, I thought I'd go back to, but around about 2007, 2008, was when I was doing some work with the AFP, in a different capacity. And it was, man, you should come and work with us. And they sold me the dream, I suppose.
There you go. Now, what are you doing these days? You mentioned something with criminal investigations.
Yeah, I'm still doing investigations. It's more to do with sort of high-end white-collar crime.
Oh, okay.
So I'm not in the AFP anymore, but I still am with a national law enforcement agency.
Okay.
And we tend to focus more on white collar crime, so high end fraud, massive
Interesting.
business fraud with people, government's
Interesting.
involvement. Yeah, so
Yeah, I just watched a documentary about, one of those stories of somebody who takes on all these different identities, and he moved all over the U.S. and he had like life insurance policies he was cashing in. And it's just like, that must be such a fascinating, talk about going down a rabbit hole with some of those stories.
yeah,
I mean, that's got to be a very interesting line of work, trying to figure out what these guys do.
it's mate, it takes its time. It's each matter might be a couple of years in the making.
Right.
So you've got to obviously try and follow the money trail, I suppose, as they say. Easiest way to catch someone is follow the money.
Right.
But it's like that, what was that movie that DiCaprio and Tom Hanks were
Oh,
in?
the Catch Me If You Can.
Catch Me If You Can, it's that con man side of things.
Yeah, that's what the one I watched, it was somewhat similar to that the Mr. Ripley one.
Yep.
The movie that was made about the talented Mr. Ripley, I think it was called, and he killed two people to cover up that his identity was going to be blown, and then he went on this cross country, just changing identities. Got a job on Wall Street with absolutely no credentials, and
exactly.
Obviously at a time that the internet wasn't a thing, and a little easier to probably catch people doing that stuff nowadays with computers and CCTV and all that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Back in especially the 70s and 80s and even in the early 90s, it's easy to falsify or get a false ID or fake your driver's license.
Right.
Fake that. You can't do that now. There's too much digital sort of footprint around. So
true.
You simply can't do that. So even though technology is better, I suppose now it's still really hard at times because these are not silly people.
Right.
Prisons, especially in Australia anyway, prisons aren't filled with intelligence criminals.
Right.
These guys are intelligent. They know how the system works and they know how technology works. And a lot of the time, they're normally 1 or 2 steps ahead of us.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. Now, I'm amazed that you reached out to talk to us, especially after hearing how stupid we can be on the podcast. But how did you hear about the show and what made you decide to get a hold of me?
Oh, look, I listen to like all sorts of podcasts, from obviously still being in law enforcement, and having a mental health background.
Right.
I listened to a whole raft of things. So like there was one I was listening to in the States called Undisclosed, which is a really good one by a bunch of lawyers, and it looks at wrongful conviction.
Oh, okay.
And like some stories around, how people, 30 years ago were, trumped up with bogus charges and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
And just the bullshit that the police pulled at the time, that in this day and age, you would just go, you can't get away with that.
Right.
So I'd finish that one, or that series, and I'm going, yeah, I'll have a look at some other things. And having been, a fan of Harold Schechter, and I read his books and, those types of things, I said, yeah, I'll have a look on podcasts, murder, or true crime. And I was just literally just scrolling through and this, murder metal, and having been a heavy metal fan since the 80s.
Yeah, you're a metalhead, yeah.
Yeah, going, hang on a minute.
This might be my thing.
This might be in my wheelhouse. So, had to listen to, I had to scroll through some of the past episodes and gone, yeah, this is the same sort of stuff that, I'd read about and listened to in the past.
Right.
And, had listened to a couple, and I think the biggest draw card was that, what you said, mate, the fact that you guys, there's a sense of humor. You don't take it seriously.
Right.
It's
trying to have
normal,
some fun with a very dark, dark subject matter. I mean, it's awful. And I try to preface a lot of the stuff as, look, I mean, this is going to be a rough one. We've got a pretty bad sense of humor. So if you're sensitive, probably want to go somewhere else,
Yeah, look, and most police have got a black sense of humour, to start with.
You almost have to, really.
You have to, and, just listening to some of them, I'm thinking, these guys are just everyday guys who aren't trying to be academics. They're not trying to, put their academic spin on things. It's just an everyday person going, holy shit, that was terrible.
Right.
And you guys say some of the things that we think. Well, we're thinking that, but
right,
we just can't say that.
We can't say that.
Officers.
Yeah, these three fools could say whatever they want, right?
Yeah, and it's like you put a really good spin on things.
Cool, very cool. Well, I got to tell you, it freaked me out a little bit when you contacted me because I saw something about federal police, and I'm like, holy shit, we finally stepped in it. What the hell did we do? It's like when I was in the band and I got a cease and desist from somebody, and it had a lawyer's return address on it. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, we don't have a lawyer, so this is definitely not good,
No,
and opened it up. Just terrible.
Yeah.
No, it was fine. As I read it, I'm like, okay, this is cool. But yeah, at first I said, oh boy, what did we do?
Yeah.
We did Snowtown Murders, and I stepped in something I shouldn't have. So I opened a barrel I shouldn't have opened there in the Snowtown.
Exactly, a stinky barrel.
Man, that was just a brutal one. We've done some good ones, and we got a few coming up, and that's why we really wanted to get you on because we're going to be doing an episode, of course, on the famous Australian case. Wanted to see your thoughts on the Port Arthur, Tasmania massacre, just absolutely horrible incident. And, like we were talking about, you don't typically see these types of mass murder incidents in Australia like we do here in the United States, unfortunately.
No, that's very true. That's very true. So, like anywhere, that has access to firearms, any country, we've got examples of it.
Right.
Port Arthur's obviously the most famous one.
Right.
Just waving to my wife, she's walking out. That's obviously the most famous one. I think it's like, the third worst mass shooting in history.
Yeah, it's amazing to think the worst one, I think, is in Norway. That guy, didn't he kill like 60? Who would have ever thought Norway would lead the pack? So it happens everywhere. But it does seem like here in the U.S., especially with the 24/7 news cycle, it just seems like it's a lot more common. I'm about 2 hours south of Chicago, and every weekend up there's 30 or 40 shootings every weekend.
Wow.
It's insane.
Wow.
It's insane.
Yeah.
But this turned Australia on its ear.
Yeah, mate, it did. It did. So we've got examples of things over the years. But they tend to be more, familial based. So, someone might shoot members of their family and then turn the firearm on themselves.
Right.
That sort of murder-suicide side of things. And, and like most colonial countries, we've got examples of, colonial brutality in the past where Indigenous people, were massacred. But as far as, I suppose, this type of thing, as I said, we're not a country that's built on independence. We're not a country that had to fight for its independence. We're not that, like your Second Amendment. We don't have anything close to that,
Really?
In our Constitution, so we haven't had to fight for our freedom, the same way as I suppose the states do, or you folks had to. So firearms, are not that common. In Australia, you got to have a license. And you can only have a license for, one or two reasons. One, you're a member of a sporting shooters club, and secondly, you own, some land, and you use it to kill feral animals.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, any other reason than that?
The laws changed right after this incident because of it, right?
Absolutely. So, yeah, our Prime Minister at the time, a lot of people don't like Prime Ministers, but, it's one of the smartest things I think he did was that, he got rid of all of the semi-automatic, and fully automatic, high-powered rifles, or firearms, and tried to implement like a national licensing process.
Okay.
So each state had its own, and they never spoke to each other. So you could have lost your license in one state, then gone to another one and picked it up.
Sure.
So he obviously, said, we can't have anything like this again. We had a massive buyback, so the government actually paid you to hand your firearms in.
Right.
So there was a like an amnesty that you could, if they were unregistered, you could just go and drop them off and they destroy them or they buy them back off you.
Yeah, it was almost 1 million. I saw it was like 800,000. That's crazy, but that's smart. I mean, if you really want to get them off the street, my argument against that, of course, is a crazy person's going to do what they're going to do. I mean, just like we did the Bath school disaster in Michigan with that guy blew up the school with pyrotechnics. So, I mean, it sure makes it easier, I think, with the high-powered weapons. So I'm not opposed to, taking those off the streets, especially for, people that don't have a damn good reason to have it,
Oh, look, absolutely. If you're a hunter, you got a reason for it.
Right.
Working, in police, part of what we also did was, we would do license checks or compliance checks on people. So you just didn't get a firearm and a license.
Right.
We have a registry. You'd have to go around maybe, I don't know, say once every 6 months, and just do an audit on them, make sure all of the firearms that they've got registered are registered and they're kept in a, a lockable safe, and you can't hang them on a wall. And
wow.
So there's still that ability to have firearms if you've got them for a legitimate reason. It's just not that every man, woman, and child essentially, has that ability just to easily access.
Right.
And I suppose the thing that opened my eyes up to maybe some of the issues was I watched Michael Moore's Bowling with Columbine.
Yeah.
Years ago, and it was like, hang on a minute, you can go to Kmart. You can go to Kmart and get fire, you can get ammunition.
Right.
You can't get ammunition here in Kmart.
Right.
So it was, and it's not as I said, it's not a criticism. It's just you guys come from a completely different background.
Oh no, I agree.
Had to fight for your independence. That whole sort of issue. Whereas we just got ours in 1906 or something.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting perspective for sure. Now, the guy that did this, Martin Bryant, he boasted that one of his main motivations for doing this was notoriety, but he obviously had some, he was diminished intelligence. He had some obvious mental health issues. But what was his deal? I mean, what do you make of this whole thing with him?
Oh,
complicated.
It's unbelievably, because he hasn't really done a lot of interviews with people.
Right.
You can see, some of the police interviews on the internet, and some of the documentaries.
Right.
But there hasn't really been, like you've had with other people, someone sit down with him and say, mate, tell us what was going through your head.
Right. His mom said he won't even talk about it because she's the only one that visits him. And I watched a 60 Minutes special on it, on an anniversary of it here not that long ago. And she was saying he won't talk about it. I mean, that anytime she's brought it up, he just clams up. So, I mean.
Yeah, well, it's strange in Australia, that there's two arguments. One is that obviously Martin's clearly the person who did it.
Right.
But secondly, there's a bit of a conspiracy theory that it wasn't Martin at all.
I did see that. There was how many witnesses? I
exactly.
mean, it's kind of hard to deny it, but yes, that's what his mom was saying on 60 Minutes. Is originally she was the one that convinced him to turn himself or admit to it. And now later recants that, says she doesn't think he was even there. And I'm like, what do you mean he wasn't there? You had all sorts of witnesses. Wasn't there video of him there too, I thought?
Video and, during the interviews that he did with police, he's drawing maps of, the
rowdy
diner.
Yeah,
the diner and who he shot first, unfortunately. So, there's still, people who believe that, Martin didn't do it.
Yeah, some sort of police. I saw that with the police cover-up. My wife and I were looking and go, wow, it's not just here in the United States that they make these outlandish fucking statements about the police. I mean, I'm not saying the police are without fault, but come on. You guys do a tough job. I completely respect it, and I don't like it when I hear people just immediately go to that default of it was the cops or they set him up, something like that.
Oh, look, and it all came out of, a single I think, throwaway comment by a politician a couple of years earlier, because there was a discussion around, gun control and better licensing. And some politician somewhere had made this throwaway comment like, the only way that could ever happen is if there was a massacre at Port Arthur.
Oh, wow.
It's just a throwaway comment.
Interesting.
And then a couple of years later, there was a massacre at Port Arthur, and then it's like, yep, has to be a conspiracy because this politician said it, a couple of years early,
Yeah.
But no, mate, it was a different time.
Right.
95, 96, 97 was a completely different time for policing.
Right.
It wasn't, Columbine really changed things on a world perspective on how police operate.
Yes.
You're normally taught to cordon and contain, contain it, sit back, cordon the area off, and wait for, SWAT team or tactical team to come in.
Right.
And then obviously there was a lot of criticism that came out of that, you had hundreds of police around and no one went in and they could still hear firearms going off. And, but that was the law. That's what, you did at the time.
So did they have to shoot him to get him? How did that end? I don't remember how that ended with Bryant.
No, he didn't. He gave himself up.
He surrendered. Okay. I couldn't remember. It's been a little while. I got to brush up on it.
There was a long sort of standoff and negotiators and all sorts of stuff. So he basically gave himself up.
Right.
But from that, things have changed. So it's now, you don't just sit back and wait. If there's a half a dozen police, you've got to, do like an active shooter and you've almost got to go hunting them.
Right.
So it was a completely different time. As you said, Martin had a few issues, from an early age.
Oh yeah.
Psychiatrists he'd seen in the past, had obviously said that, he's at risk and he's at risk of violence. And I think one point around about 1990, he was having a conversation with a psychiatrist and said, I want to go and shoot a whole stack of people.
Wow.
Wow.
So, and then it didn't help that lady, that he was with died and gave him like almost $1 million. So now he's amassing all these weapons. He's flying around the world just so he could talk to people on the plane. I thought that was bizarre. And he would go to a store just to buy something so he could talk to the clerk. I mean, obviously a very, troubled kid. And, unfortunately, with all that weapons and ammunition at his disposal, I mean, he just, 35 dead, I think 23 wounded, just horrible. I mean, really bad. Yeah. Little kids.
Absolutely.
3-year-old kid I saw. I mean, just, awful.
Yeah, well, absolutely, mate. And you're spot on, he was incredibly lonely. Mm-hmm. And he was awkward and, he'd try to make friends with people and, his entire life, everyone was like, this guy's peculiar.
Very inappropriate comments. I saw that one video of him as a kid being interviewed. He lit off some firecrackers and hurt himself. And they said, "Are you going to stop?" And he's like, "No." He just laughed. He goes, "I'm going to keep doing it." There's just an example of weird comment that you wouldn't expect a kid after they just got hurt to say,
Well, he was, part of it, I think, was they looked at him. His IQ was, quite low. He was, I think, 66 or something. So it was the lower end. Yeah. Lower end of the, the IQ spectrum. But then, he had, what was called Asperger's, which is like an autistic spectrum disorder.
I saw that,
and that's that whole issue of, people being awkward, not being able to have... not being able to bond with people, having, those silly, inappropriate comments. Right. Not being able to pick up when someone's getting annoyed at them. They still think, oh, well, I've got to keep talking to them because they're listening. Right. And that whole, when Helen or whatever her name was, gave him all of that money, it was just... unbelievable. And you did see, from what he was doing, like going to the shop, traveling around, on flights, the best part of the holiday, wasn't going to somewhere exotic. It was sitting next to someone on the plane having a chat. Right. So that ability, mate, absolutely peculiar guy.
Now, what sort of sentence did he get? And what is time in an Australian prison? How would it compare, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the prisons here, but I mean, what kind of time is he doing? Is it, is he in a bad place, or where's he? Is he separated from everybody else like they'd probably do here?
Yeah, look, he's, to the best of my knowledge, looking through it, mate, he's isolated. He's certainly not in general population.
Right.
He got like a life sentence for each of the 35 people that he killed.
Yeah.
And the judge had said like never to get parole. And then on top of that, he got time for each of the other 21 or 23 people that he injured, and again, never to be released.
Right.
So he's not going anywhere.
Right.
Anytime soon.
And he's secluded by himself, basically. So
yeah, he's secluded. He doesn't, as you said, with his mum, mate. He doesn't talk about it. He doesn't watch television shows about it.
Yeah, I saw that he's not allowed to watch
No.
television shows. I saw that the TV he watches is out of his reach, so he can't even change the channels, which I thought was interesting because that's definitely not flying here in the U.S. I mean, they've got him right in their cells and everything. So,
yeah, no. So I think it's more to do with him, because of the nature of what he is. Especially the notoriety around it. We might get excited and start to relive it again. And he had been on suicide watch for a time, and tried to harm himself. So maybe the thinking is that if he's reliving it, he's going to get depressed again.
Yeah. That's a good point. Now, moving from this one, we're going to be doing another case, of course, another infamous case there in Australia. David Birnie, his wife and Catherine, the killer couple. We've done a few of those, raping and murdering 4 women in their home and attempted to kill a 5th. We see cases like this with Ken and Barbie in Canada, Fred and Rose West, but where sometimes the woman gets off with less time than her male counterpart. And was that the same here with Birnie and his wife? Did she get less time?
Well, she ended up getting 4 life sentences.
Oh, okay.
And in Australia, we tend to run sentences like consecutively, so they're together. So you won't get, like, if you get 2 life sentences, you won't get a life sentence which is 20 to 25 years, and then when you finish that, you've got to get another 20 to 25 years.
Right.
They're run concurrently. So whichever is the most serious offence. So if you murder someone and get 25 years, but then do something else that might get you 10 years, you're still only going to serve the maximum, which is the 25. You're not going to get the 20 then plus the 10.
Right.
But she's been inside for a while. I know that she's been looking at getting parole. I think she's in her 70s or something now, and it's still thinks that she should be paroled.
Of course,
but, mate, she's not going to, again, like Western Australia, she's not going to get out.
Yeah,
no one's going to let her out because there was no remorse even in the parole hearings. From what I looked at and read, no sense of remorse.
Yeah, horrible. Both of them were horrible. My God.
Terrible.
Terrible. Really bad stuff, but definitely worthy of us to do a case or a podcast on those two. So that'll be coming up.
Do women normally get less of a sentence in the States?
I think so. I mean, when you see these killer couples, I mean, the Ken and Barbie case with Paul Bernardo and Homolka, she got quite a bit less time than he did. She wound up getting out, and there's a lot of people, that evidence has come out after the fact that she was more involved with the murders than he was. But of course, he got the bulk of the time. I'm not sure how many. I'm sure there were life sentences, and I don't know if Canada's, not usually as harsh as we are with the, no possibility of parole stuff, but. But yeah, I mean, she got off quite a bit with less time. I think that just, it's just, I think, human nature, as much as we try to, make the sexes even, I think males are typically going to look, less harshly at a female than they would another male. I mean, it's just human nature, and seems like they get lighter sentences when they do those killer couple stories like that.
Look, and it's certainly, on average the same here.
Yeah.
females would normally get, a lesser sentence, especially if it's, involved in any sort of, 2 or 3 people doing it.
Right.
If there's a dominant male like, David in this case, if there's this perception that, she just followed along and was just, a willing participant as opposed to being, the mastermind.
Right.
She should get something. But some of the things, because I actually hadn't heard of this. Australia's an interesting place. It's obviously it's a massive country. It's the same geographical size, I suppose, as the States.
Right.
In land mass. But if you take, the population of your top 5 cities, that's all of Australia. That's the whole population.
Well, you got a lot of outback where it's pretty desolate.
Yeah. So we don't, if something happens in, Western Australia, so the far west, maybe we might get a day of a newspaper article.
Wow.
But especially back in, the 80s and the 90s, if it didn't happen in your backyard, it certainly wasn't reported like it would have been. So I actually didn't know much about this one at all.
Yeah, because he recently died. I think it was a suicide. Well, not recently. It was 2005. He died in his cell by hanging, which is interesting. I don't know how common that is in Australian prisons with suicides and that sort of thing.
Look, it's not uncommon. It's certainly not something that happens all the time. It's probably rare. You talk to any police officer or any custodial officer, mate, they say, yes, we know of someone.
Right.
But it's not, something that happens all the time. It's a rare occurrence.
Right.
Prisons in Australia tend to be, reasonably well managed, and, they're certainly not severe, in comparison to some of the ones that you see in, in the States and, in other countries.
Black Dolphin
Black
in
Dolphin.
Russian. That's
Mate,
brutal, man.
That's
That's
amazing.
our 4th most listened to episode on Murder Metal Mayhem is our one on Black Dolphin. That was absolutely just vicious, man. Like complete silence. I mean, to me, that would be the worst of all of it. I know prisons are loud, but the opposite, like total silence is... Oh man, I don't know how those guys don't go out of their gourd in a cell where you can't talk and you're complete silence. That's unbelievable.
So they have it reasonably good, as far as prisons go. But it's not uncommon. It's not uncommon.
I see. Now, one of my favorite episodes we did, it may have been the first Australian case we did, Catherine Knight. I think it was a Mother's Day episode, the first year we were doing the podcast, and absolutely brutal. I mean, skinning her boyfriend in one solid piece of skin is just absolutely mesmerizing. But how is she getting along in prison these days? I don't remember where she was from in Australia.
She's in New South Wales, so she's in Sydney, which is 3 or 4 hours away from me here.
Oh, okay.
In a place called Silverwater, which is probably one of the biggest maximum security prisons. And one of the oldest prisons, I suppose, in the country. Yeah. Like she's one of these people who demonstrated no remorse. She won't be getting out anytime soon. Right. I did a bit of background on obviously on that matter. I had heard about that. That's one of the ones that I had known about. But just some of the things, like belting people over the back of the head with saucepans.
Frying pans,
Frying pans.
That poor guy had like a fractured skull, and he's just
on a wedding night.
They only had sex like 5 times, and she was mad that it wasn't 10 or something.
Yeah, and so she smashed him with it. Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, holy shit. That was just nuts. And every now and then she ends up in a killer cage match, and it's like, man, who the hell is going to fight that bitch? I mean, holy crap.
No one's fighting her.
Most guys would run the other way, She fought like a man,
and just really like from a I suppose a policing background, like really interesting. Yeah. Case but rough. Like you said, just fighting people in pubs and not giving a shit.
Right. His head was in a pot on the stove, and the kids' plates all had little notes next to them, so they were going to eat it. Holy shit!
Yeah, and threw one out in the backyard.
Right. Really bad. Really bad.
Yeah,
really
she was
bad.
nuts. But she's like that. She's like that Kathy Bates.
Yes.
Character in Misery.
Yes, she is.
Yeah, that same sort of like. Oh,
very much.
That.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Now, you mentioned you heard our Ivan Milat episode, another brutal Australian case. And you said you thought we did a decent job with that, so we sure appreciate that. But what do you think about the nephew there following in the family tradition? That was a strange twist at the end of that story.
Yeah, very much. Very much. So
horrible.
Everyone, even growing up, obviously it happened. I was a kid growing up at the time, and everyone has known about Ivan Milat. Everyone's read the books. There's a very good book called The Road to Nowhere, which is and it talks about, his brother and, Richard, and, I think the Supreme Court judge at the time said that, there's got to be more than one person involved, and he thought that Richard was possibly that person.
Right.
But, with the nephew, he just wanted to be famous.
Right.
He was probably, a no one, just
yeah,
had
and
the
that
same,
poor kid, it was his birthday. I mean, what a terrible story,
Yeah, and making comments like, I'm going to be as famous as my uncle. And,
right. And then to do it in Belanglo State Forest too.
Belanglo Forest, it's same. If I'm that kid and when we're going somewhere and it says, and I've got a Milat in the car and we're going Belanglo State Forest,
I don't fucking think.
Let me out.
Right.
Like, stop here, and I'll walk home.
Is that anywhere remotely close to you?
Yeah, it's about an hour, a bit over an hour up the road.
Looks beautiful. I mean, it looked like a really nice place,
Yeah, it's a national park, and there's a lot of bushwalkers go there. It's a very popular hiking place.
Right.
As I mentioned to you when earlier on, my wife was looking at doing a mushroom picking outing with some people around here who pick mushrooms and truffles.
Right.
And and they had an overnight stay one where you could camp, and it was at Belanglo State Forest. And she's like, no, man, there's no way I'm going on that.
Yeah, in the Milat cottages or something.
Walking around trying to find truffles and mushrooms and come across a fucking body or something.
Right.
So
yeah, brutal.
That's not far. That's maybe an hour.
Interesting.
Over up the road.
Interesting. Now, I stumbled on a documentary on the very first Australian serial killer, William MacDonald, who was born in the UK but eventually migrated to Australia. He murdered 5 from 1961 to 62. And I'm interested, since you guys don't have, the volume of serial killers that we do here, would that have been a case maybe that would have been part of police officer training or detectives on serial murder?
No, not at all. Not at all. Most police, when you go through, it's a 6-month course. So you do 6 months and you're spending more time in that looking at, what evidence is and what your police powers are and,
right.
Learning how to use of force, so firearms training, etc. Even when, you do detectives training, they don't tend to do a lot of specifics in relation to, serial murders or serial homicide because they're not common. So if you're doing a homicide, they would probably, more likely do training in relation to what you're going to see every day of the week.
Right.
So it's, family-based, killing or, anything like that.
Right.
So even having obviously been, a detective for years and going through the training and having done homicide courses, etc., they're not things that we tend to focus on, unless you're specifically doing a workshop or something that relates to serial murder.
I see.
It is just, you might do a missing person, case that then ends up being a murder.
Right.
Or a murder and, something that's happened and you're just following on of, how they found the evidence, etc.
Right.
They don't dive into a lot of, serial-based killers because, like, even with the Snowtown murders, they, it's not something that's brought up as far as a training exercise.
Sure, because like you said, I mean, that's pretty rare. So, I mean, it probably would be a waste of time to even trained somebody on something they're probably never going to see.
Yeah, 90%, 96% of murders, anyway in Australia is committed by, someone that the victim knows.
The knows, right. Yeah, they always talk about that on the, crime shows. They go to the husband, the boyfriend, those are the first people they're talking to.
Absolutely, so, it's more to do with, that
right.
sort of issue with, let's look at what happens 90% of the time.
Sure.
And not worry about, maybe the 10% that may or may not happen.
Right. Now, I know that countries look at serial murder differently. How does Australia define a serial killer as compared to the U.S.?
Mate, we're pretty much the same as the way you do it.
Is it 2 or 3?
It's 2. Two or more.
2 or more, and then a cooling off period.
Separate occasions. They've got to be, completely, separate incidents.
Right.
Can't be, murder one and then, walk around the corner and then murder a second person.
Right.
Because that's just classified as, like essentially the same.
Spree killer.
Yeah, it's the same incident.
Right.
You just got two different victims.
Right.
So it's pretty much the same. It's 2 or more.
Okay. I was just curious because it's interesting how different countries look at things. And I know even here in the U.S. it's changed. It hasn't always been. I think it was 3 at one time, and they changed it to 2 or more a few years ago, quite a few years ago. But still, it hasn't always been that way here. I was just curious over there how you guys look at that.
Yeah.
Now, are there any other Australian cases that you can think of that maybe would be good for us to do? Something maybe unique. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of them, but are there any that kind of rise to the top?
Look, there's one that's I suppose from an interesting perspective, a lady called Kelly Lane.
Okay.
So Kelly was an Australian water polo representative. And a few years ago, her case is quite famous because she was having pregnancies and no one was knowing and giving up children and having abortions. But she'd given birth to a baby girl, the day that she came out of hospital. Like no one knew she was pregnant. So she's had this baby. The day that she got out of hospital, later on in that afternoon, she's at a wedding for a friend and there's no child in sight and the kid hasn't been seen since. And she's saying that, she handed it over to the child's father, but there's no evidence of who the father is. And
oh, wow.
So it's that's a really interesting one.
Yeah.
It's not brutal. It's just,
but I love stories like that too. I mean, not necessarily have to be this huge body count, but just a fascinating story with some interesting twists.
Yeah, like
Kelly
she
Lane,
definitely
I'll have
is.
to check that out.
Kelly Lane, yeah. So Kelly Lane, like she is still inside. She's from Sydney. For me, obviously coming from where I come from, it's an interesting case. Not just from a policing perspective, but because she was a lot like some of the people in the past. Craved attention, loved the attention, was trying to be an aspiring athlete. Couldn't be pregnant. If you're an aspiring water polo player, because you can't really hide it.
Right.
And then gave up children, or that her family didn't even know that she had. Like she ended up having kids that her mum and dad weren't even aware that she'd had them.
Holy shit! Wow.
And she'd given them up for adoption, or she terminated prior pregnancies. But with this one, it's quite bizarre that she's had the baby, got out the same day. She's at a wedding, and the child's never been seen since.
Wow. Interesting. I'll definitely check that out.
So that's definitely one. We've got others around the place, like we've got examples of old ladies who back in the 40s and 50s who have poisoned multiple husbands, and probably the same.
Dorothea Puente.
Yeah, exactly the same kind of things. We've got examples of serial murders who almost have the same catchphrase or name as you guys. So instead of like, the night stalker, it might be the night crawler.
Right.
So it's there's some similar sort of things there.
Yeah.
But yeah, certainly, I'm sure you can find, look online.
Always looking for new stuff to talk about. We've got quite the list of topics that we still haven't even touched yet, and the list keeps on growing. Now I gotta ask you, as an Australian, because I've been learning more about Vegemite. We actually tried some on the show. If you've heard that one. We actually ate it with some toast and butter. I actually didn't think it was that bad, but the other two guys almost threw up. But what's your verdict on Vegemite?
Oh, I love it.
You love it?
Yeah, most Australians, we grow up with it. You either like it or you don't.
A lot of butter.
I'm not I'm more of a Vegemite on the toast than the butter on the toast.
Oh, okay.
So I would rather have that thicker. It's probably like you guys growing up with peanut butter and jelly.
Yeah.
Everyone's probably tried it at some point. But look, as kids, mate, you eat it out of a jar with a spoon.
Oh, wow. Yeah, Sean from In Malice's Wake's like, mate, you need to put a lot of butter on that toast, and a little Vegemite goes a long way. So that's how we did it.
And no, I'm the opposite.
We couldn't find any Australian beer, so I had to get some Foster's, and I know that's not.
No.
I know it's not Australia, but that was the best I could do in my area. That was all I could find. But we did have some Yellowtail wine. My wife likes that, and so we had a little bit of that. But yeah, it was funny because, of course, all our Australian listeners are like, "That's a bunch of bullshit. That's not Australian." And we knew.
Mate, I can't remember the last time I even saw a Foster's can anywhere.
So what is like, if you were to name a couple of big Australian beers, what would you say?
It depends what state you come from. So if you come from Queensland, which is north, it's 4X. So it's just a 10 that's got 4 red X's on it.
Okay.
If you're from New South Wales or the ACT, which is, where we are, it's something like 2Es. And Western Australia have got Swan. So each state have got almost like their own type of beer.
I see. Okay.
But we've also got, boutique breweries are a dime a dozen now here.
Right.
So mate, in Canberra where I am, there's probably half a dozen, boutique breweries.
Right.
Let alone the really, really, big ones. But so they're some main ones. We've got, some very good brewers. There's actually an American guy called Chuck Hahn.
Okay.
So Chuck came to Australia to work for 2Es and then broke off from that to become Hahn Brewery and then sold that and has now got his own little boutique thing called James Squire.
Cool.
And, and he's like the dean of the faculty of beer makers in Australia.
That's cool. Well, interesting. Anything else, Mick, that you want to add? I'm sure we'll have you on again because just from talking to you, I'm thinking of all these little discussions we could have. But anything you want to add? I mean, you're a listener, so we appreciate that. You're a 666 Club member, and we appreciate that, of course. But anything you want to add about what we've been talking about or something else?
No, mate. Look, obviously, thank you for having me on. I think the work you guys do is different to what a lot of other people do. As I said, crime podcasts and people talking about true crime are a dime a dozen.
Right.
But there's not a lot of people who go on and have a sense of humor about it. And some of the things you've got to have that black sense of humor.
Right.
Otherwise you're just getting too depressed about reading this shit.
Yeah, the Catherine Knight stories. I mean, holy shit, So we do try to keep it fun. It is funny that we broke into the top 200 comedy podcasts on Apple, but yet we're a true crime heavy metal podcast, but we somehow broke into comedy. But we do like to have fun, and I'm glad that it shows because we've had listeners say, it just sounds like a couple of friends talking with a beer in my apartment.
Absolutely.
And we're just having a conversation. None of us are, 40 degrees. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think with that tends to come a little bit of haughtiness, a little bit of, very, clinical about it, to the point where like we've had like Harold Schechter on, who's a really nice guy, but he's a little bit academic, and, we're not. So, it's just kind of like a little oil and water there, where Dr. Peter Vronsky was throwing the F-bomb around, and he was much more our style. So Catherine Ramsland is cool too. But, those people have their place, of course, but we try to just do it like, like you said, just a few friends, sitting around a table, having a few beers and laughs, and trying to make some semblance of humor out of the worst of the worst, Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And putting a human perspective on it, because people are, clinicians are going to, talk their clinical jargon,
right?
And you're going to, like when whether it was Harold or whoever, brought up folie à deux,
right?
And you're like, so all these, technical terms where, most people just want to hear someone go, "Oh, that was fucked. That was the shittiest story I've ever fucking heard, man."
Exactly.
What's going on in that person's head to make them want to fucking do that? That's crazy.
Right. And we do try to bring in, like we recently did one on Dr. Death, the neurosurgeon, and my wife had a neurosurgery go wrong. And so we do try, to bring in, people that have a legitimate perspective, like you, or like Tex when we do prison stories. My daughter has a master's in forensics, and she came on and talked about when we did the Billy Milligan case, the guy that had 27 personalities, and was the first time it was ever used as a criminal defense, and got him off of a rape charge. So it was just interesting to have her perspective. So I think we try to, legitimize it in a way by taking it seriously, but I think you can still have a little bit of fun and make it interesting rather than making it too serious, because it's depressing.
Mate, absolutely, because this is you probably listen to more than I have, but all you can listen to an ex-policeman or an ex-psychologist or an ex-psychiatrist talk about their conversations with serial killers until you're blue in the face,
right?
And they're all the same. They all talk about the same thing. It's just almost like a cut and paste, and someone else is talking it.
Right.
Whereas at least you guys and there's a couple of others, that are just, let's just look at this from, a general layperson's perspective.
Right.
Cool. So it's looked really good. But if you liked that one about, the multiple personalities, there's a famous book and then a movie called The Three Faces of Eve.
Oh yeah.
So
that's good. Sybil. Sybil's another one. The psychiatrist that diagnosed Sybil was involved with the Billy Milligan case too. There's a book called The Faces of Billy Milligan, which is really fascinating. Those kind of cases are really, really neat.
Because the guy who wrote The Three Faces of Eve that it was based on was a psychiatrist in the 40s called Harvey Cleckley.
Okay.
And he has a book called The Mask of Sanity. So in the dean of psychopaths, so if you want to know about who's who in the zoo of psychopath experts, he's the one who started it all. Interesting. So his book back in the 40s is just, the seminal book on what a psychopath is. And it's not always, that's the Ted Bundys and those sort of people. It's your secondhand car dealer.
Everyday people, yeah.
It's your bank manager. It's highfalutin people, and he's really, and that's where I think a couple of episodes ago, one of the Canadian ones spoke about the psychopathic checklist. Mm-hmm. And the guy called Robert Hare is the dude who put that together, and he's got a really good book called Without Conscience. Okay. And that whole entire package, that psychopathic checklist, is based on Harvey Cleckley.
Interesting.
So it's when I first started, because I'd worked in prisons, back in the day, and worked in some different sort of settings, and that was the Bible. So that's
Interesting.
really,
I'll definitely check
really
that out.
interesting.
That's excellent. Excellent. Well, Mick, we really appreciate you doing this interview today and for your support of Murder Metal Mayhem. We do really appreciate it. And I'm sure we'll talk again. But until then, horns high from the United States.
Horns high, mate, from down under.
All right. Very cool.
Thanks, buddy. See you later.
Mother, man.